Blacks had always believed, from slavery time when they were denied the opportunity for education, that education was power. They figured, well, the master can read and cipher, and that's where his power comes from. And then other black people just wanted to read the Bible before they died. And as Booker T. Washington once remarked about the time after slavery, it was a whole race of people trying to go to school.
Constitutional scholars, legal scholars assert that Brown is one of the most significant judicial opinions in this country, yet it absolutely remains misunderstood.
You really can't understand how important Brown was until you understand how awful segregation was. A lot of white people think that it was just, the back of the bus. But what segregation was, essentially it was coast to coast and border to border subjugation of black people and an assault on black people's feeling of wholeness and feeling that they could control their own lives and their own destinies.
Segregation was first challenged in 1849. Benjamin F. Roberts, an African-American active in the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, attempted to enroll his 5-year-old daughter, Sarah, in an all-white primary school in Boston on 4 separate occasions. The school committee rejected Sarah's application each time.
So her father challenged that in court, and he was aided by a very prominent, very famous lawyer named Charles Sumner, later became a United States Senator. And he argued before the Massachusetts Supreme Court that school segregation was a violation of fundamental constitutional rights. And the Massachusetts court rejected this, and they said it is up to what they call the paternal wisdom of the school board to decide what is in the best interests of the children. And they said the best interests of both the white and the colored children will be served by keeping them separate.
On January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, beginning the process of freeing the slaves throughout the South. The subsequent passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution bestowed upon former slaves the full rights of citizenship. However, the successes of the post-Civil War period, known as Reconstruction, were short-lived. As Union troops pulled out in 1877, white Southerners began to implement a system of segregation throughout the South. Gradually, more and more local, county, and state laws were enforcing the separation of the races. In 1896, a local case about segregation on railroad cars in Louisiana made it to the Supreme Court. The court upheld segregation by ruling that separate but equal facilities did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
Well, Plessy was an 8-to-1 decision of the Supreme Court. And of course, the majority opinion didn't rely on any precedent other than school segregation cases. But there was a very famous dissent in that case by Justice John Marshall Harlan. And Justice Harlan made the point that I think is sort of overlooked, which is that segregation has nothing to do with the equality of the facilities. In fact, in Louisiana, the railroad cars for blacks were equal to those for whites. But the point was that simply designating a certain group of people to be segregated on the basis of their race stamped them with a badge of inferiority. That's what Harlan, his main point was. And Harlan said in his dissent, the Constitution is colorblind. It neither knows nor tolerates distinctions among citizens. And I think that was a very important point, that the Constitution itself was designed to treat every person equally, regardless of their race. That is the 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
Plessy's separate but equal was the law of the land for nearly 60 years. In 1909, however, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was created in an effort to fight injustices that faced African Americans.
If African Americans were going to achieve anything in American society, to ever become equal, they would have to have a good education to be able to get good paying jobs and eventually enter professions and, compete equally with whites. And since the schools in all the southern states, and in fact many of the northern states, were segregated, the NAACP decided that school segregation should be their main target.
Charles Hamilton Houston was largely responsible for starting this initiative for the NAACP.
Houston became dean. He had already done some civil rights work, but became dean of the Howard Law School. And he turned the Howard Law School essentially into a West Point for civil rights lawyers. And the first class he had, Thurgood Marshall was first in that class, and Oliver Hill, who handled one of the cases in Brown v. Board, the Virginia case, was second by a hair's breadth.
In October 1934, Charles Hamilton Houston recommended to the NAACP board that the organization concentrate its legal efforts on ending discrimination in education. The fight must begin, he argued, under the prevailing separate but equal principle announced in Plessy.
Houston did a survey, traveled the South, and took films of black schools and white schools and took notes and had very well documented about how unequal the education systems were. Then black people in the South began coming to the NAACP with education cases.
Houston's proposed campaign to attack segregation in education impressed NAACP leaders, who appointed Houston special counsel. In 1935, from his post at the NAACP headquarters in New York, Charles Houston planned his legal campaign to end segregation in public education. Whites claim that the backwardness of blacks justifies poorer teachers, wretched schools, shorter terms, and an inferior type of education. Discrimination in education is symbolic of all the more drastic discrimination which Negroes suffer in American life. The objective of whites is to prepare blacks to accept an inferior position without protest or struggle. The discrimination in education practiced against the black was no accident. Charles Hamilton Houston.
Moreover, the powerful view in the South, and to a lesser degree in the North, that education was wasted on black people. There's nothing useful going on between their ears. You couldn't educate them, so why waste money on them?
Before a frontal attack on segregation could be made, favorable precedents must be established. Big trees in the legal forest, such as Plessy, fell only when their roots became so weakened that they could no longer sustain the weight. Charles Hamilton Houston. Houston's team of NAACP lawyers, who included Thurgood Marshall, Oliver Hill, Spotswood Robinson, Jack Greenberg, Robert Carter, and others, would string together an impressive record of victories before the United States Supreme Court, using the Equal Protection Under the Law clause of the 14th Amendment, once again challenging the nation to live up to its higher ideals.
But in those cases, the Supreme Court did not directly confront or overrule Plessy versus Ferguson. It simply said that if Southern states were not going to provide blacks with any access to university or professional training, they would either have to set up separate schools that were equal in quality or admit blacks to the white schools.
In my view, the most important one was from Clarendon County, South Carolina. It was called Briggs versus Elliott. And they started out, it's a heavily black county. They started out simply asking for buses to take their kids to school because they had to travel so far. And the case evolved. It was tried in the federal district court in Charleston. And the trial judge was a man named J. Watus Waring.
One thing that Thurgood Marshall picked a state, and he picked a school district that was really the epitome of inequality. Clarendon County, South Carolina. It's a very rural county, cotton-growing area between Charleston and Columbia. And it was a county that in the late 1940s was 70% black. The black residents had an average of a 4th grade education. They didn't hold any public offices, hardly any of them could vote. And the schools that their children went to were, by any definition, deplorable. I mean, they were basically located in shacks out in the country with no indoor plumbing, no electricity, no desks for the students. The kids all sat on benches. They had no textbooks, and the teachers were not even trained. Many of the teachers had no more than an 8th or 9th grade education themselves. And what Marshall thought was, if he could bring a case that showed that separate but equal was a total fraud, that this was inequality indisputably, that this was a case that the court would have to confront the issue of Plessy versus Ferguson.
The NAACP had developed 2 strategies. One was to use Plessy against Ferguson against itself, and that is to sue for equalization. Come in and prove the disparities and then ask for equalization, feeling that no state could afford to equalize everything and they'll finally say, okay, heck, we'll integrate. The other was to come right against Plessy and say Plessy itself is unconstitutional.
A very determined, courageous minister, Reverend J.A. Delane, decided to challenge the county to provide school buses for black children.
The white kids had buses, and they would drive past the black kids, splashing dirt and mud on them as they went past to their all-brick schools, while the black kids trudged along the country roads to their shacks. And that's when Thurgood Marshall got involved in the case. He heard about it, he came down to South Carolina, and he told Reverend Delane and some of the black parents in Clarendon County, I'll bring a lawsuit, but there have to be at least 20 plaintiffs, because there's going to be retaliation. You may face danger, economic risk, or even violence. There have to be enough people to share this risk.
In 8 months, the legal counsel recruits 20 black parents to file the lawsuit Briggs versus Elliott in federal court.
Now, Harry Briggs had 5 kids in school. He was a Navy veteran of World War II. He worked as a garage mechanic for the mayor of Somerton, the white mayor of Somerton. Elliott was the chairman, the white chairman, of the Clarendon County School Board.
Marshall argues the Briggs case in state court in Charleston.
When Judge Waring told Thurgood Marshall that he had to challenge segregation directly,
And Waring got him to dismiss the case and come back and go against Plessy dead on.
and so Marshall decided that the best way to do this was to show that segregation hurt black children. Not only the fact that they went to bad schools, but the fact that they were separated from white children hurt them, hurt the way they felt about themselves.
Marshall and the team of NAACP lawyers hire New York University professor Kenneth Clark, who was the nation's leading authority on the impact of segregation on the self-image of black children. He performed a very simple but very revealing test. Clark showed 16 school children a set of dolls. One doll was white, one doll was black. The dolls were similar in every other respect.
And he said to these kids, which doll is the white doll? Which doll is the black doll? And the kids all got it right. Then he said, which doll is the good doll? Which doll is the bad doll? And 11 of these 16 kids picked the black doll as the bad doll and the white doll as the good doll. And what Clark concluded from this, and what he testified to in the Briggs case, was that these black kids had come to see themselves as inferior, that white people were the good people and they were the bad people. There was something bad about being black and being separated and segregated.
And South Carolina itself acknowledged the fact that there were huge disparities, and their defense was, well, we recognize, gosh, we just noticed that there are these disparities, and we're going to do something about them. That was their defense. They could not defend the status quo as approaching a constitutional standard of equality.
Because this case challenged the constitutionality of a state law, it had to be heard by a 3-judge panel. The verdict was a split decision, with Judge John Parker and Judge George Timmerman deciding that they had to follow the precedent set in Plessy versus Ferguson. The third judge, J. Waites Waring, wrote the dissenting opinion.
Well, what Judge Parker said in the Briggs case was that the state officials in South Carolina had made a promise that if they had enough time and passed laws to raise tax revenues, they would in fact make black schools equal to white schools. But Judge Waring wrote a very impassioned and lengthy dissent in this case.
If they are entitled to any rights as American citizens, they are entitled to have these rights now and not in the future. And it is the duty of the court to meet these issues simply and factually, and without fear, sophistry, and evasion, that segregation in education can never produce equality, and that it is an evil that must be eradicated. Judge J. Waites Waring.
And at the end of his opinion, he concluded, he said, segregation is per se inequality. That is, by itself, it's unequal. And that was the point of his dissent, and that's what Marshall used as his argument in the Supreme Court. After they filed the lawsuit, the white officials and the white plantation owners in Clarendon County retaliated. Harry Briggs, who was the lead plaintiff in the case, was fired from his job at the mayor's gas station. In fact, on Christmas Eve, the mayor handed him a carton of cigarettes and said, "Harry, you're fired." And his wife was fired from her job as a motel chambermaid. Reverend Delane, who was responsible for the case in the first place, his house was burned down. He was charged, falsely charged, with assaulting whites, and he had to leave the state of South Carolina, and he never returned.
There were 4 other cases that led to the famous Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision. In 1950, the overcrowded and segregated schools in our nation's capital were becoming increasingly embarrassing to a nation that claimed to be a beacon of liberty and an example for freedom-loving people around the world.
Now, the District of Columbia, the city of Washington, D.C., is unique. It's the nation's capital. And in fact, it's the seat of our government, the Supreme Court, the White House, and the Congress. And surrounding all of these institutions in the 1950s were segregated schools. This was a shame, a national shame. And in fact, within just a few blocks of the Supreme Court building were segregated public schools.
Gardner Bishop ran a barbershop on 16th Street, just north of the White House. He took his daughter Judine to enroll in the local junior high school closest to their home. She was turned away, so he decided that he was going to challenge this law. Mr. Bishop went to the school board meetings to argue that segregation in the schools was wrong, but he was ignored.
So what he finally did, he took a group of 11 black kids down to John Philip Sousa Junior High School, very brand new school, a really nice school in southeast Washington, D.C., just opening that year. Took the black kids in and said, I want to enroll these kids. And the principal said, I'm sorry, we can't do that. They have to go to the colored schools. And what Gardner Bishop was arguing really was that they should send the black kids into these schools because there was room. His daughter and most other black kids were going to double shifts in their schools. They were so overcrowded that they had to have 2 shifts of students each day. So that was the basis of his complaint, that, to really equalize the classrooms between the white and the black schools.
He then contacted Charles Hamilton Houston, Dean of Howard Law School in Washington, D.C., and together they filed a lawsuit challenging segregation in the District of Columbia.
But the suit was not based on the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment only applies to the states. So they relied upon the 5th Amendment to the Constitution. It says that every person shall have liberty under the Constitution, cannot be deprived of liberty without due process of law. And they argued that sending these black kids to segregated schools deprived them of liberty.
In the 2 Delaware cases, Lewis Redding, a black civil rights attorney from Wilmington, Delaware, convinced the plaintiffs to confront the constitutionality of segregation in the public schools. Redding was determined to fight for a more equitable education system in his home state, a state where, in 1950, black adults averaged just 7.2 years of schooling, 3 years less than white adults.
He didn't want just more buses or better schools. He wanted to challenge segregation. So he brought the suit, and it was in state court, not federal court. And it came before a state judge, a man named Collins Seitz, who was a native of Delaware, had attended schools there. And Collins Seitz made a very important ruling. It was the only case in which the judge ruled that segregation violated the law, and in fact ordered that these black kids be admitted to the white schools.
I conclude that the separate facilities and opportunities offered these plaintiffs are not equal to those offered white children. By refusing these plaintiffs admission solely because of their color is violating the plaintiffs' rights protected by the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Chancellor Collins J. Seitz.
But Judge Seitz also said that he could not directly overrule Plessy versus Ferguson. That would have to come from the Supreme Court. Well, Thurgood Marshall called Judge Seitz's ruling the first real victory in our campaign. And it was. It was the first time any judge in the country, state or federal, had ordered the admission of black school children into a white school.
Unlike the other Brown cases, both of these cases were appealed by the state to the Supreme Court.
One of the myths out there for all these years has been that the Topeka case was solely about a child wanting to go to her neighborhood school, not being able to do that. Father was angry and sued the school board. The Topeka case, in fact, developed because McKinley Burnett, who was the chair of the NAACP, had tried for 2 years, 1948 to 1950, to get Topeka Public Schools simply to choose to integrate their elementary schools. It was permitted, not required in Kansas. So they could have, at any meeting, simply chosen to integrate their elementary schools.
But it was a case that was very different from the others. First of all, Topeka had a relatively small African-American population, about 8% of the city's population. And in fact, in the whole state of Kansas, there were only 4 schools that were segregated, 4 elementary schools in Topeka. The state had passed a law back in the 19th century that said that primary schools could be segregated, but only in the largest cities, and in fact only in 2 cities, Wichita and Topeka. And only in Topeka were the primary schools segregated. So this was really an exception. All the other schools in Kansas were integrated. It's just these 4 schools.
It made it clear that African Americans in that state understood that even though that state offered certain freedom and certain promises, that education, the very basis of our democracy, still was something we had to struggle to have access to completely.
And he had been arguing before the school board of Topeka for years that they should end this grade school segregation, but they had ignored him. So he finally organized a group of parents, including Oliver Brown, to challenge this.
I think the NAACP understood what they had in Topeka, because unlike South Carolina, D.C., etc., it was not about stark disparities. It wasn't about quality. It wasn't about poor facilities. It wasn't about not having school buses. The fact that Topeka schools were equal in facilities, teachers, etc., allowed the court to finally rule that separate but equal has no place, because Topeka schools were equal. So that allowed them a true test of the 14th Amendment.
Prince Edward County, Virginia, in the southern part of the state, it's tobacco growing country. It was very different from Clarendon County. It was almost equally divided in population between whites and blacks. And in fact, many of the black farmers there owned their own land. They were relatively more prosperous, but their kids still had to go to bad schools.
The Prince Edward County case was unique because the movement was led by a group of courageous high school students from the Robert R. Moton High School in Farmville, Virginia.
The high school that we were attending school in, a brick building, was built to accommodate 180 students. And on the day we went on the strike, there were 456 students in that particular area.
The high school for blacks in Farmville, the only high school in the county, had tar paper shacks for overflow classes.
They were cold in the winter, hot in the spring. When it rained, it leaked in some of them. And it just, the atmosphere and the climate, and it just wasn't conducive to modern day learning.
They had outdoor toilets, no running water, and of course they had pot-belly stove. And in most cases, those stoves were inadequate.
And that was a thing that started the students to thinking about we needed a new school.
And the students in this school decided on their own, without any prompting from adults, that they were going to protest these conditions.
The parents, for years, worked through the PTAs and other civic organizations trying to get the county to build a new school. And the county just kept dragging their feet. They couldn't find land, or they didn't have money, or any excuse not to build a new school. So the students decided that let's try it our way. And that's when the students organized themselves. A committee of 6 or 7 or 8 or how many organized themselves, leadership of Barbara Johns, John Stokes, Carrie Stokes, John Watson, J. Samuel Williams, Carl Allen, was the core group to organize themselves to come up with a plan to get the county to build a new high school. And that's how the strike came about. That's all they wanted, a new school.
Barbara Johns was a strong-willed 16-year-old junior, and she was fed up with the inadequate facilities at the Moton School. She decided to do something about it and told the student council about the plan.
So when Barbara Johns approached us in October 1950 and said, we must do something about this. So this girl had a fire in her that I had never seen in anyone before. And she would say things like, if you all don't do it, then I'll do it. I said, no, you can't do that. Well, I'll go to church. No, you can't do that. And then we decided to develop a strategy, a program, and that is covert, because they had tried everything else.
And she decided to get together a group of other students, a very small group, who were all sworn to secrecy, including John Stokes and John's sister Carrie and a couple of other students. And they planned a strike.
You know, these guys, the adults had tried, they had failed, so let us try this thing. So we started working, started our little underground movement.
And what they did is they put together and they made picket signs and hid them away in the school shop. And then Barbara Johns called an assembly. She told the principal that there were students who were in trouble at the bus station, and he ran out of the school, and she promptly called an assembly. And all the students came, and then she said, "This is only for students. Teachers have to leave." And in fact, some of the teachers were actually escorted out of the auditorium.
Then Barbara got up and told them what her plans were, the fact that we had backed her.
And then she said, "We are going on strike. We're going to go down to the school board office in downtown Farmville, and we're going to demand better schools. In fact, we are going to demand a new school."
A new school. Okay. That's all. We, at that time, we were asking for a new school. That's all we were asking for. That's all we wanted. We pulled it off on the 23rd of April, 1951. We pulled it off because of the fact that the powers that be did not realize the impact of the unrest among the people. And so we knew that the children had to lead them. We knew that the children had to lead them.
And they also contacted lawyers from the NAACP in Richmond, Virginia, Spotswood Robinson and Oliver Hill, who came down to Farmville and said, "We'll support you. We'll file a suit, but only if you will attack segregation in the schools."
The children who initiated the incident that precipitated the case, all they were thinking in terms of was correcting some of the defects at the school in which they attended. They wanted to make that their contribution to, as a graduating class, to the kids in their community.
They told the students that they were not dealing with segregated schools any longer. Equal facilities, that's what they used.
You don't just want a new school, you want integrated schools. And that's what they agreed to do.
And after much deliberation, consultation with their parents, they decided that that's what they would do, go for integrated public schools.
So the students all picked up their picket signs, walked downtown, went into the office of the superintendent of schools, who refused to meet with them. But they carried on this strike, and they really threw a scare into the local officials. They were afraid, in fact, that there would be national publicity, which there was about this strike. This was an unprecedented thing. You know, students actually going on strike, marching with picket signs in a southern town.
That was a turning point, because it lifted the weight off of our shoulders and put it on the shoulders of the NAACP. And we walked away thinking that we had a victory. But the fight had just begun.
Well, the NAACP lawyers who took the case from Prince Edward County, Spotswood Robinson III and Oliver Hill, were very frank with the students. They said, "We are not going to win this case in Virginia." And they knew that when the case went before a panel of federal judges, all of whom were natives of Virginia, all of whom were committed segregationists, that they were not going to win this case. What they were trying to do was to build a record to show the conditions in the schools in Prince Edward County, the inequality of the black and white schools, to bring that record to the Supreme Court. So in a sense, the trial in the federal court in Richmond was really just a way stop to the Supreme Court.
The students from Farmville faced serious consequences. Barbara Johns was forced to move to Louisiana to escape constant threats to her well-being. These threats became more ominous the day before the student strike ended.
The Sunday before we went back to school, when we broke the strike, there was a cross burn on the R.R. Moulton High School's law.
One fella told me that when he told his parents that they said that they're going to put them in jail if they didn't go back to school, and the parent reply was, "How large is the jail?" When those students walked out of this building where you were sitting in 1951, it started a movement that dismantled segregation. But what those kids did here in 1951, there was no Martin Luther King, there was no Jesse Jackson, there was no Rosa Parks. It was these students here, John Stokes, Carice Stokes, Barbara John, John Watson, J. Samuel Williams, and all of the others. What those kids did here in 1951 was the catalyst that started the modern civil rights movement as we finally got to know it.
Brown versus Board of Education is first argued in front of Chief Justice Fred Vinson's Supreme Court in 1952.
President Harry Truman really felt that it was time for the federal government to take a stand. So racial segregation in the nation's capital was really, as the Secretary of State said in the government's brief to the Supreme Court, a source of national embarrassment to this country. And I think the government's brief really had an impact on the Supreme Court.
Persuaded by Justice Felix Frankfurter, the court decides that it will need a unanimous decision on such a controversial issue and requests that the case be argued the following year. Chief Justice Vinson dies in September 1953 and is replaced by Earl Warren, former governor of California.
Segregation, as one lawyer for South Carolina said, had grown into the lives of the people. And to ask the country, particularly the South, to change this way of living that propped up their psyches in such a way, you couldn't have a split decision. You couldn't have some of the members of the court saying, well, maybe it means that, or the Constitution says this. It would have given impetus to all kinds of resistance. So and the court doesn't have an army. The court just has persuasive powers.
As the pressure from both sides continued to mount, Chief Justice Warren followed the previous year's agreement to seek a unanimous court. On May 17, 1954, the court issued a unanimous decision. The opinion was written by Chief Justice Earl Warren.
We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we hold that the plaintiffs were deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Chief Justice Earl Warren.
The court, however, put off the question of implementation of the integration of public schools until the following year, when they heard the case that became known as Brown 2. Justice Felix Frankfurter, fearing the public's reaction to the decision, actually crossed out the phrase "issued forthwith" and replaced it with "all deliberate speed."
The reaction to the decision, the all deliberate speed decision, was very unanimous in the Deep South. All the public officials declared, governors, senators, members of Congress, state legislators declared, we are not going to obey this decision. And they made it very clear. The Southern members of Congress, almost all of them, with the exception of 3 senators and a handful of representatives, signed what was called the Southern Manifesto. It was drafted by Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, that said the Southern states will resist by any legal means the unconstitutional decision of the Supreme Court.
It's time for the Longines Chronoscope, a television journal of the important issues of the hour. Our distinguished guest for this evening is the Honorable James O. Eastland, United States Senator from Mississippi.
Just how are you people going to handle your this latest Supreme Court decision about segregation in your home state, Mississippi? You going to have trouble down there?
Of course we're not going to have any trouble. We have no racial friction at all, Larry. But we're going to retain segregated schools. It's approved by both races. Everybody's satisfied. Conditions are good. And we're not going to pay anything about any attention to a political decision by an incompetent political court.
Nevertheless, sir, aren't you sworn to uphold the Supreme Court in its decision?
Yes, but if people don't want to go to school together, who's going to make them?
And then, led by Virginia, the southern states decreed that policy of massive resistance to segregation.
Well, a lot of people read that as any means. And in fact, there was an outbreak of violence around the South. And as integration came to places like Kentucky and Tennessee and Texas, there were local mobs, some of them whipped up by outside agitators, racist agitators, and there was violence in the streets. Some of the governors had to call out National Guard and state police troops to restore order in these communities.
We're the sunny South, and let's show the nigger he's in the sunny South.
Many public schools throughout the South were closed. In their place, private academies for white students only opened. Parents would receive tax credits to subsidize their tuition payments. In some cases, the public schools were closed for several years. In Prince Edward County, Virginia, the schools were closed for 5 years. Eventually, public schools throughout the entire country were integrated. But not only schools, separate drinking fountains, bathrooms, lunch counters, all disappeared from the American landscape. Legally, African Americans made their case for the 14th Amendment guarantee of equal protection under the law. The vision of Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall, Oliver Hill, and the entire team of lawyers from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was finally realized. However, legal integration did not necessarily mean actual integration.
Looking back from the perspective of 50 years, we all have to agree that Brown was a landmark decision of the Supreme Court. It was really the first time in the court's history that it is stated, and it stated it unanimously, that racial segregation violates the Constitution. That was an important pronouncement, and it took a long time for the court to get there.
We obviously have a far more integrated society than we had before. This conversation is going on in a public university in the state of Virginia, where I teach. What I do every day that I'm at work would have been illegal in 1954. But now I have the title of eminent scholar, conferred on me by the state of Virginia, the state where my grandmother was born only 9 years after slavery, in poverty. All of that has been as a result of the way Brown destroyed segregation, formal segregation, in all ways, not just in schools.